I recently released a video entitled What is the Last Days Tribulation? That video was designed to help describe what the tribulation is, where the prophecy comes from, and what it meant historically and as a last days sign of the times. This video is to help us understand which last days prophecies will happen during the tribulation. So if you haven't watched that other video, I would strongly suggest watching that first, as this is essentially a part 2 video. As stated previously, the tribulation is believed by most Christians to be a 7-year period of time just prior to Christ's return, based on a prophecy by Daniel in the Old Testament, and then mentioned by Christ himself during his mortal ministry when asked about the last days. In another recent video entitled Second Coming Remaining Events, I listed the remaining events that are prophesied to happen prior to the Second Coming. They are mapped by things that are going to happen in Israel, the New Jerusalem, and globally. But in this video, we are going to take those events and add one additional layer of granularity by stating which events are prophesied to happen during the 7-year period known as the tribulation, with the later half being the Great Tribulation, where God's judgments are poured out without measure. And to get this out of the way up front, I explain in many of my videos how common Christian belief is that at the end of the 7-year tribulation, the second coming happens. But in reality, when Christ appears at the end of the tribulation, it is to save the Jews from Armageddon. This isn't the second coming in glory, which happens later. But let's get into this. So let's start with a few things that need to happen prior to get them out of the way. The prophecy to preach the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people are throughout Scripture. But here are 3 places that can be found. There is also a prophecy for when the missionaries will be permanently called home, which can be found in these places. As of September 2022, there are 411 missions worldwide, but there remain still 30 to 40 countries where we cannot proselyte yet. These first prophecies help us illustrate 2 types of prophecies we will be dealing with. The first are things that go over a period of time, such as the gospel being taught in all the world. We have been doing it, we are doing it, and we will be doing it into the future, but it will end at some point when it is completely fulfilled. Another type of prophecy is one that is a singular event, such as the missionaries being called home. But by my reading, both of these happen prior to the tribulation. The Jews returning to Israel was foretold, has been happening for some time, but will be fulfilled prior to the tribulation. This is a prophecy that it is easy to both say it has been fulfilled because the Jews have been flooding back to Israel for over 100 years, but it will continue to happen until the tribulation begins. The last days apostasy and ultimate rejection of the gospel by the Gentiles both roughly end about the time the tribulation begins. The persecution of the saints largely happens before the tribulation because it is the persecution that, according to John the Revelator, sends the woman fleeing into the wilderness, which most believe is the church heading to Zion for protection. But this won't be the end of the trials for the saints. The third temple in Jerusalem being built also needs to happen prior to the tribulation. In fact, it may be this event or others surrounding the third temple that ultimately triggers the tribulation. One of those events might be the prophecy around the red heifer, although as I explained in a video on this subject, that the red heifer prophecy has already been fulfilled from a Christian perspective, whether most Christians believe it or not, but from a Jewish perspective, it hasn't yet been fulfilled. And so this still may happen and trigger events, but I don't consider it a prophecy that must be fulfilled. The Great Famine is the first prophecy that extends into the tribulation, but it likely starts prior to the tribulation. Some of the Isaiah passages about the famine seem to indicate that this is one major reason for some of the wars and conflicts, because of the severity of the famine and the lack of resources available as a result. But now that we are in the period of the tribulation, remember that most Christians believe this to be a literal 7-year period of time. It is unclear from Scripture how early the mark of the beast happens, but it does appear to be in place for some or all of the tribulation. It would appear that between the persecution of the saints, the mark of the beast, and other things, that it is at the beginning of the tribulation that a remnant of saints heads to Zion. The saints then build the city of Zion and a temple. A great scourge covers the land, which Scripture makes clear is a sickness, so I take it to mean a pandemic. But moreover, there are 2 of these verses that specifically say that the scourge continues until the Lord comes. It isn't clear whether that is his saving of the Jews or his coming in glory, but for the purpose of this chart, I'll make it to the end of the tribulation, but it could extend further. We now enter the 3.5-year period known as the Great Tribulation, which is the back half of the 7-year tribulation. Clearly, some early scholars needed a marketing degree. It would seem that all-out war both in America and the Old World is what kicks off the Great Tribulation. The war in Israel is known as Armageddon, and it would appear that wars happen at both locations through the end of the tribulation. The way most Christians interpret the scriptures is that these wars are kicked off when the Antichrist breaks a covenant it made with Israel. So the Antichrist has been on the scene since the beginning of the tribulation, but is revealed as the Antichrist when he defiles the temple, which is called the abomination of desolation, and begins a war which happens near the midpoint of the tribulation. So from this point forward to the end of the tribulation is called the Great Tribulation, meaning God's full wrath and judgments will be poured out. This is where two witnesses come on the scene, protecting Jerusalem from the opposing army, and unleash identical plagues as Moses and Aaron did upon the Egyptians before the Exodus. This happens over the rest of the tribulation period. I know there is a lot of information here, and I'm not spending a lot of time on any given prophecy, but keep in mind I have done individual videos on most of these subjects, so now would be a great time to subscribe if you haven't already so you can easily find the other videos to dig in deeper. But this is an example of one of those videos where I just talk about how the last days plagues exactly match the 10 plagues in Egypt. There also appears to be evidence that there are witnesses and plagues released in the Americas from Zion similar to those in Jerusalem from the two witnesses. I have another video on that if you're interested. The Battle of Armageddon rages over the 3.5 years, and eventually the opposing forces kill the two witnesses and parade their bodies in the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 days. When suddenly Christ comes down to the Mount of Olives, and when he touches it, it splits in two. This massive destructive power destroys the attacking army and saves the Jews from ultimate destruction. This is the moment when they look upon him, see the wounds in his hands and feet, and Christ says, "These are the wounds with which I was wounded in the house of my friends." It is at this moment the Jews realize he is Jesus Christ, the one whom they crucified in the meridian of time. This is the moment where the Jews accept the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the moment that ends the time of the Gentiles and begins the time of the Jews. This event is often confused with Christ's second coming in glory, but that comes later. So this ends up being the event that converts the Jews to Christianity. It is also prophesied that Christ will appear at the temple in Zion, the New Jerusalem. But the impact of Christ's return is felt far and wide, and much of it is part of the prophecies of the last days. According to Scripture, this appears to be right when the greatest earthquake ever known happens, which explains why the huge army is destroyed. At the same time, the sun is darkened, the moon turns to blood, and the stars fall. It's probably at this point some people might be asking, Kevin, how can you know when to plot these on a timeline? These last prophecies give us a really good example of how to do that. You can see with these 3 scripture verses where each of them talks about 2 events. Matthew 24:29 says, immediately after the tribulation. So we know it goes right at the end of the 3.5-year period that the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give her light. You can cross-reference that to Doctrine and Covenants 88:87, which talks about the sun hiding his face and shall refuse to give light, and the moon shall be bathed in blood. This verse also says, at the same time, the earth shall tremble and reel to and fro as a drunken man, speaking about the earthquake. You can cross-reference both of those with Revelation 6:12, which talks about the great earthquake again at the same time as the sun becoming black and the moon turning to blood. Looking at Revelation 16:18 through 21, which seems to be talking about the same series of events, and while the sun darkening is noticeably absent, we have additional events added, including the prophecy of every island fled away and great hail. We can branch out into Revelation 8:7 through 12, which talks about those same events again with others. And from here we could branch out to other cross-referenced correlated prophecies that help us determine a sequence of events. Now this is a very simplified example, but this type of data mapping is what I have used to determine which events go where. But this isn't a perfect science. Some scriptures contradict one another, and sometimes an event seems to be the same thing but may actually be different. So I would, as always, encourage you to study this out for yourself and come to your own conclusions. But this allows us to put those additional prophecies, including the islands fleeing and wormwood, here, as well as the great hailstorm. Then, if you take Scripture literally, which some people do and some people don't on this next prophecy, this is when the continents come back together. It is unknown if this is an event or something that happens over some period of time. This period of time from Christ saving the Jews until his return in glory is the half hour of silence spoken of throughout Scripture. Some people believe this is a 21-year period if you use the calculation calculation of 1,000 years to man is 1 day to God, then a half hour is about 21 years. But we don't have any idea how long it will really be. But it likely won't be 30 minutes because of all the prophecies that need to be fulfilled during this time, unless you believe they are all symbolic and not literal. The prophet Joseph Smith said of this period of time, quote, "Judah must return, Jerusalem must be rebuilt, and the temple and water come out from under the temple, and the waters of the Dead Sea be healed. It will take some time to rebuild the walls of the city and the temple, etc. And all this must be done before the Son of Man will make his appearance." So I won't go through all of the prophecies that happened during this period in detail, but those are in that other remaining events video I spoke of. This video is meant to focus on those within the tribulation itself. It would seem the final event prophesied prior to Christ's return in glory is his appearance at Ammon-Diamon. Key events to look for that would signal we are close to the beginning of the tribulation would be first and foremost the third temple being built in Jerusalem. Then it is game on for all the tribulation events that lead to Armageddon and the saving of the Jews. But remember, that isn't even the second coming, as we have to have the half hour of silence and several other things prior to his coming in glory. So this is my best guess as to when the remaining prophecies will be fulfilled before, during, and after the tribulation. But that is just based on my study. As you can see, most remaining prophecies happen during the tribulation, and most people believe that that is a 7-year period, and the most severe of which will happen in the last half, as prophesied. You very well may find and believe different things when you read, which is fine. The most important thing is that you study these things yourself, listen to the Spirit, and remain faithful until the end. Thanks for watching.